John Hendrickson, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Mike.
Very happy to have you. So a quick bio for people that might not be familiar. So you grew up in the Washington D.C. area, and you're now a reporter for the Atlantic magazine. Although I guess everything nowadays seems to be more online than it is old school magazine, but that's how the Atlantic came to fame, and it's one of the biggest magazines in the world, I think. So we're very, very happy to have you on. And I had first heard about you when you had written the article on Joe Biden late last year, I believe it was, when that came out. And that obviously really got the stuttering community's attention. That was a big thing, and Biden for many years had not been necessarily so out there talking about his stutter that often. So that was I think, kind of a watershed moment in his career. I know he had done some stuff. He had spoken for the NSA, I think, once, or maybe in the past. So he had done some things, but that was really a kind of a look inside of his stuttering, I think, like it never been done before. So jumping into your story a little bit. So I had heard in a previous interview that you had done with John Moore, where you had said from the time you were a kid, you had the dream of becoming a writer at a magazine. And you had mentioned that perhaps that had at least partially come from a drive to do something in life that proved that you were, what was the phrase you use, essentially intellectually on par with other people, if not at an impressive level. And I think many of us people that stutter through our life have had that concern, that feeling that other people might see us as less intelligent, but because we weren't as fluent as most people are, normal, quote unquote, how we thought of it probably as a kid. And so that motivation to go above and beyond. And I know we can't run history twice, so we can't say, hey, John, what would your life have been like if you didn't have the stutter? But do you think you would have been as focused on achieving such a lofty goal if you had been just a regular kid with no stutter?
I think about that sometimes, and just a larger meditation of what would my life be like if I talk like everybody else. I think all of us have that question in the recesses of our mind. I think it's okay to ask that question, but this is our life, and this is the hand we're dealt, and all we can do is make peace with it, and all we can do is try to produce meaningful work. I absolutely think that my stutter, it has forced me to work harder and to constantly try to prove myself, for better or for worse, because I have been turned down from jobs. I have been discriminated against, as I'm sure nearly every person who's stutters has been, or people with other disabilities have been. I'm grateful for that drive and that determination, because I think all of us who are a stutter, we approach life with a lot of grit, and that's something that you can't buy. That's something that you just have to earn over time. So I think it's like anything, I think it has its positives and negatives.
That makes sense. And you're right. Well, and many of us, myself included in high school, was constantly comparing myself to who I thought I would be if I didn't have the stutter. But in retrospect, looking back, and I don't think I've talked about this on my other podcasts yet, but it's entirely possible that if I hadn't had the stutter during those younger years, that I would have partied more, spent much more time chasing relationships. But as it turned out, the stutter sort of gave me bulletin board material, to borrow the sports analogy. I knew that the world, to some extent, or at least I thought the world, was guessing that maybe I wouldn't amount to that much. I don't know if that's true or not, because I wasn't inside of people's minds, but that's what I imagined. And so for example, when I graduated, well, for the interview, the mock dental school interview at the end of college, one of the professors who had been my organic chemistry professor, so he's like, now, before we start on this practice interview, Michael, you know, as a dentist, you're going to have to talk to people.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, thanks for letting me know. Continue with the interview, you know. And then 5 years later at my residency there in Brooklyn, one of the attending doctors said something almost identical. So I was wanting to get my first practice open as soon as possible. And so I was kind of peppering him with questions on logistics, getting a loan, getting insurance, all that kind of stuff. And he said, now, Michael, you know, as an owner, you're not just going to have to talk to patients. You're going to have to talk to staff. You're going to have to talk to vendors. There's going to be talking all day long. And they were both very nice people, very much trying to be helpful. But, well, and as you had mentioned previously, that concept of forgiveness, I had learned not to hate people because they weren't fully enlightened on what was going on inside of my mind and was stuttering in general. And so I didn't bring the hate kind of forward and let them, you know, ruin my day or week. But I did use it as bulletin board material. So essentially take that negative, quote unquote, people's low expectations and use it for motivation. Mm-hmm. And at that point, coming out of residency, my goal was to have 1,000 dentists working for me. And so, and that was more ambitious than anybody I knew. I didn't know anybody else that had, you know, that kind of business ambition, at least in my circle of people I grew up with and went to dental school with. And I remember at the time asking the question, am I trying to compensate for something here? Like, why? Mm-hmm. Right? You know, because I like to read history and, you know, Napoleon, some of these big names in history were probably trying to compensate for some sort of feelings of inadequacy at some point. Mm-hmm. I said, screw it, I'm just going to take over the world sort of thing, you know? But yeah, so that how much of it is positive and negative, and what we turn into a positive, that how we transform a negative into a positive, I think is something that exists in the minds of quite a few people that stutter, and maybe other folks, with other disabilities as well. But that trying to compensate, if indeed that's what it was, trying to prove to the world can turn into an internal source of motivation and determination, as you said.
It absolutely can, and I think those external validations can feel nice. They can temporarily prop you up. But I think what you and I are doing, and talking about the realities of having a stutter and the complexities and the uncertainties and the very real low parts of it, I think that is where we truly begin to make peace with ourselves. And that is really that first part of that path to forgiveness, of not only forgiving those who have wronged us and patronized us and infantilized us, but forgiving ourselves as well.
Absolutely. And I heard you mention that as of a year ago, that, well, and in particular before the Biden piece was written, that, I'm not sure what the right phrase is, but you were less self-actualized, if you will, when it comes to your stutter. That the Biden piece, it sounds like you didn't use the word cathartic, but my impression was it was almost cathartic. And you mentioned that the print editor, I guess, was kind of pushing you to put more of you into that article, and you were kind of like, yeah, we'll put a little me, but more, way more Biden. But she encouraged you to go as close to 50-50 as possible, and that really got you to dive into and sort of explore your own thoughts and feelings about this. And obviously, since the Biden article ran, I mean, as you said, there's just been an outpouring of support from people that stutter, and no doubt a lot more interest amongst all your circles in stuttering, I would guess. And has that all had a really positive effect in terms of getting you to talk about this thing that for most of us, for most of our life, was sort of a deep, dark secret, the last thing we wanted to shine any light on?
Talking about my stutter and writing about it and meeting other people who stutter, all of that has changed my life. It hasn't even been a year since the Biden article came out. I think it's been something like 9 months. And I'm very, very far away from any type of self-actualization. If anything, I'm only at the beginning of that journey now. But I always viewed stuttering as my problem, my thing, this lonely, weird, painful, clumsy, awkward thing about me. And I never met many other people who stutter. I've only met, prior to the past year, I'd say that I'd only met maybe like 4 or 5 people in my entire life who stuttered. I certainly never went to any conferences or any support groups. I certainly never identified myself publicly as a person who stuttered. Just occasionally here and there with like maybe a college essay here, maybe a job application here and a cover letter, just but it was never a thing that I talked about with my friends, with my family. It wasn't a thing that I really ever wrote about publicly. It was a thing that I preferred to just push aside. And so I feel like I am really, in a way, just entering this new stage of life. And more than anything, the biggest change of my life, and I'd say accomplishment of my past year, wasn't interviewing the person who would go on to become the Democratic nominee for president. It was meeting and joining this worldwide community of people who stutter.
That's really cool. And you're not the first person. In fact, I've heard a lot of people say this. Once you start getting to know other people that stutter, it's a real game changer. And you've mentioned that now a couple of times, the sense of isolation of being a person that stutters. Because let's face it, right? Most of us don't speak up necessarily. So maybe we were at a party in college with somebody else that stuttered, but we never met them because they weren't talking much and we weren't talking much. And so people that stutter are not, even though we're supposedly 1 out of 100 adults, it's way less than 1 out of 100 of the people that I've met in my life. And I don't think I've ever met one outside of groups that I go to with other people that stutter. Mm-hmm. In my case. So you spoke about that stuttering. I heard you in the previous interview mention that stuttering was almost, I'm not sure if you used the word superpower, secret weapon maybe is the phrase that you used as a writer, as a journalist, that it, I think you said it disarms people a lot of times. And that was my experience also. So I had a much stronger stutter, better stutter, whatever you want to call it, going on for the first 41 years of my life until a couple of years ago. And so I would interview all the doctors that would start in the practices. And by the way, I never got to 1,000 dentists. Once I got to 10, I was like, running a business is harder than it looks. I think and I had kids, so I was like, so I stopped at 30, and that's where we're at now. But so all those first 10 years of having the practices, I was the one that would interview the doctors. And there's an instinct to think, oh, they must think, I just inherited these practices from my dad or something like that. Like I didn't earn it, or I'm a fraud because of this stutter. But the way I kind of trained myself to think about it, and I think it honestly is more accurate, and it's true, the first 2 things they knew about me, one that I was, Dr. Wilson that owned all these practices, that I was interviewing them, right? And the other thing they knew is that, first thing they knew is that I had a pretty severe stutter going on. And I chose to think, and I think if people were thinking about it logically, they would think, wow, that's, right? I'm just like when they meet you. Wow, this guy's a freaking reporter at the Atlantic. but he's got a, pretty good stutter going on. That's impressive. Like, he's an impressive person, because this would have stopped many people. And I kind of think of it as the Stephen Hawking effect. So Stephen Hawking, even if he was able-bodied, was one of the great physicists, from my understanding, of the 20th and early 21st centuries. But non-physicists, regular people, would have never heard the name Stephen Hawking, probably, even if he had been that great of a physicist, if he wasn't severely disabled. So having something like this becomes an opportunity to inspire people just by being us. Whereas most people walk around, and as far as we can tell, they're normal. There's nothing inherently that jumps out at us, at first at least, before we know them, that's like, oh, this person's really inspirational. But somebody who, calls you up, is a reporter from the Atlantic, but he's got a pretty good stutter going on, it's like they know immediately, man, this guy's got something internally, some sort of, will to get the job done, or work ethic, or intelligence, or something that has catapulted him to be able to still be doing very impressive things despite, having a challenging speech impediment. And so talk about that, like that secret weapon aspect of
it. That's a very positive outlook that you shared. And that's how I view other people. If they're people who stutter and they're living their life in the face of it, if they're people with other disabilities or other setbacks, anything, those positive thoughts are my thoughts. But when I often think about myself, it's harder to be that positive and optimistic and that, like, earnest, I guess is the word, because I always had this little voice in my head that's telling me, everybody I'm interviewing, every competitor at other publications, they all view me as a charity case, and they all think of me as the, like, person with an asterisk next to his name. And it takes a lot of work, and it takes therapy and just reckoning with those types of feelings to try to transfer yourself from that negative self-talk to positive self-talk. But if I look back on my career, I graduated from college and I got my first job in journalism 10 years ago this month. I was out at the Denver Post in Colorado. And I think about all the different articles I've written, all the different people I've interviewed, all the different types of events I've covered, from the last election and the conventions to interviewing some rock stars like David Byrne and Jeff Tweedy and 50 Cent and other people. And I think about, like, well, what made those interviews succeed if they did succeed? Not everything's a success, obviously, but what made the one's work, the pieces that I feel good about. And the answer is almost always that the person I was interviewing quickly let their guard down, and they got very real with me, because when I talk and when you talk and other people who stutter talk, we are nakedly ourselves, and we are just, it can look clumsy or awkward, and it doesn't look or sound the way that other people talk, but this is how it is. This is who we are. And I think that you touched on something that some people, come at us with negativity and with judgment and with pity, and others respond to us with, I think, some recognition, like, wow, you're here, you're doing this, you're being real, so I'll be real.
It's totally. And especially when you're in a position of power, and obviously in your case, it depends who you're talking to, right? If you're talking to the president, well, then you're not in a position of power. But if you're talking to, doing a story on, regular folks, then you are sort of in a position of power. So it's interesting. Did I understand you right when you said essentially when you look at this or you look at this in other people, you see that it makes them, well, that they are kind of inspirational. I mean, if somebody's got some, serious, or challenging thing going on, and yet they're out there doing really well in life, not holding back, not hiding from the challenge. So when you look at this kind of intellectually and say, what makes sense here, that is inspiration. Mm-hmm. But when it's looking at yourself, perhaps because these painful memories, I think for just about all of us, goes back deep into childhood, right? And that sense that the stutter was not okay, and that it did make us, inferior on some level, that those are feeling. So it's hard to look at ourself in an objective third-party way because it's all wrapped up with our feelings and emotions going back to when we were little boys, essentially.
Exactly. And like right after the Biden story came out, I did a couple TV interviews and a couple radio interviews, and I had never done any of that. And a lot of my colleagues and family members and friends complimented me. It was kind of overwhelming praise, and it made me uncomfortable. I didn't know the way to react to that. But I instinctively took their compliments as like pity. I took it as a pat on the head, like, good job, And then over time, as months went by, and mainly as I began regularly emailing with people who stutter all over the world, I could peel the onion back a little bit and say, oh, like, maybe this is real. but we teach ourselves to be defensive and to kind of like, we build up such a thick skin sometimes that it's hard to shed that thick skin. I think getting older, and you know, just talking about my stutter more, meeting other people who stutter, talking to people like you, who have nuanced, wise perspectives on the whole thing, that really helps me, because it shows me that there's a lot of other people out there just trying to figure it out as I am.
Well, and I think so in both of these scenarios, whether we're taking the negative side of that, like, oh, they're just telling me I did good in that interview on MSNBC because, they think I must feel bad and they're trying to make me feel better, sort of a pity thing. Or the flip side, well, they must think I'm a freaking hero because, of course, it takes a lot of, courage, a lot of chutzpah to go out there and, stutter and be different. Now, the truth is 100% of people are not having the same thoughts, right? There's all sorts of thoughts that are going through people's heads, maybe even conflicting thoughts in the same people. And so there's a song from the 90s, I remember, showing my age, the early 90s, that had a big impact on me. And I should probably look up the title of this song, just keep quoting it like this. But it's a song that says, you never know just how you look through other people's eyes.
Yeah, it was, it's Crash Test Dummies or Meat Puppets, or, yeah.
That rings a bell, yeah. But that's absolutely true, right? You never know just how you look through any individual's eyes at any given time. Even people we love, maybe they're being a little nicer than what they really think about you, or maybe they're being a little meaner than what they really think. You just never know. So that's kind of a loser's, or it's impossible to read people's minds. So we're never going to know. So it's kind of like spending all day, just worrying about letting our mental energy be sucked away based on what other people might be thinking. But if we can connect our emotions to what I think is the most logical perspective, which is that it does indeed take courage to stand up and talk, just like it took a lot of character for Stephen Hawking not to give up on his dream to be a great physicist just because he became severely disabled, I think in his 20s is when it happened to him. And so from a logical standpoint, I think we are more, well, I know it takes courage to go on MSNBC and talk when you got a, good stutter going on. But I do think, well, one thing I know for sure is that it puts other people in a different place than they're usually at. Like normal quote unquote conversations, blah, 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 and like sometimes we're talking over each other and all that kind of stuff, right? I'm not saying it's all like, gibberish, but, there's a lot of that, right? And so I think that, I'm certainly very impressed by you going out there. And like John Moore pointed out, there aren't very many people that stutter that have had the courage that you have to, write about it. I mean, when tons of people are going to read it, go on national television for the world to see it. And it's certainly providing an example of what's possible. And just by the sheer fact of where you have gotten yourself in life proves that if you don't give up on that dream, you know, doors are not necessarily closed to us that we might think are closed. Maybe some. Maybe we're not going to be an air traffic controller where the planes are literally depending on us, spitting right on time. But most things we can totally do.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. And another thing, just looking back on the whole project, what I told my editor last fall is that I don't think that it's necessarily a story about Joe Biden, and I don't think it's necessarily a story about me, but that both of us are merely vehicles to carry the reader through this larger phenomena and through the life and the experience of a person who stutters. Like, we're the characters, but it's bigger than us. And at the moment, I'm in the early stages of reporting and researching and putting together a book about stuttering, and it'll kind of carry the baton from where the article ends. So, not a book about Joe Biden at all, but it's going to be just about the life experiences of people who stutter. And so I've already been interviewing some folks. I plan on interviewing people over the next year longer. And there's amazing commonality that emerges. And there are all these unique anecdotes and unique stories, but the depth of our experience is universal.
I agree. It's amazing. You can step into a room with 10 people you've never met, and they all stutter, and we understand deep things about each other from the second that we step in there. And I think
Exactly.
I'm not sure how, this is one of the few, things I have, I guess, that's made me very different than the masses. But I don't know how much this exists in other groups with conditions. I would imagine it does exist in other groups as well. It's, stutterers, people that stutter are not unique in this sense. But so I know you got to run. So one last question. So because Biden's never opened up like this fully as he had. And once he did your article, he then opened up about it in a CNN town hall.
Mm-hmm.
And he spoke about it with Trevor Noah.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking about more than he ever has. My guess is that's not a coincidence, because the Bernie campaign and then the Trump campaign were kind of hammering him on the possibility of cognitive decline. I would imagine, because Biden is a obviously successful politician. They know how to play this game. He probably sat down, I would guess he sat down maybe with his advisors, because you said he was reluctant to do your article at first.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think they made the calculation, look, infinitely better to be known as a person that stutters than a person who's losing his marble, that's in cognitive decline. Do you think that the opening up about stuttering was directly connected, in your best guess, to trying to refute this idea that he was in cognitive decline because he's 77. He's been in the public eye since I think the 1970s. So he's had a lot of time to open up about his stutter, but he never did previously. Do you think it's a coincidence that he's doing it now, that he's being accused of cognitive decline?
That's a very interesting question. And it's a question that my editor and I discussed at length last fall and through the winter, and I think relatively recently as well. When I reached out to his campaign at the beginning of last summer 2019, as I wrote and as you noted, they were very cagey, and they didn't even agree to an interview. They were keeping everything at arm's length, and it took months of follow-up emails and calls and texts, and then they finally agreed, and we finally talked at the end of summer. And I talked to him for just over an hour, from 1 foot away in his office, across the desk. And at no point in our conversation did Joe Biden actually say, "I still stutter." I had gone into the interview that day thinking he would, thinking it would essentially be his coming out. And as the minutes are ticking by in our interview, and it's, okay, now we've been talking 30 minutes, 35, 40, 45, it begins to dawn on me, oh, he's not going to say it. He's not going to actually affirmatively articulate this. And I left his office that day beating myself up, thinking that I had failed. I was asking myself, well, what's wrong with you as a journalist? You couldn't, get the goods. You didn't get the money quote. You didn't bring it home. And I was mad. I was resentful, for a couple weeks. And then as time went by, the whole story just turned on its head. And it goes from an official declaration of "I still stutter" into why won't Joe Biden actually say that sentence affirmatively and declaratively. And that became the nexus of the piece. Over time, we published my story online a week before Thanksgiving. 1 month after that, right before Christmas, there was a Democratic debate, and Biden stuttered many times in that debate. And Sarah Huckabee Sanders, former White House press secretary, sent a tweet mocking him, and Biden's official account replied to the tweet saying, "Actually, I don't recall his exact language offhand, but it was on the lines of, I've spent my entire life working to overcome a stutter, and I'm proud to mentor kids who stutter. And Sarah Huckabee Sanders ultimately apologized. And that was a big turning point. He didn't say the simple sentence there, I still stutter, but that was a turning point where another thing unlocked. And then a month after, it was that CNN town hall that you mentioned, in which he took a question from the audience. I believe it was a parent of a person who stuttered, and he was opening up about it. He was raw about it, and to my memory, I could be wrong here, but to my memory, at that town hall, he was empathetic and honest, although he didn't actually say that phrase, I still stutter. And to date, the closest he's come, I believe, is in that Trevor Noah interview from a couple months ago, where he said, some days it feels like, or sometimes my old stuttering days come back. And again, that's not an exact quote, but it was along those lines. And that's pretty close, you know? So I think, like all of us, I think Biden has been on a journey, and he reached a point after college and right around the time he entered the Senate, in which he was mostly fluent and successfully managing his stutter. And I think that most of the population was unaware of any trace of it, or minimally aware. And I think now, you know, he's 77, he'll turn 78 of a few weeks after the election. And I'm not a doctor, I'm not at all qualified to diagnose anything about cognitive decline, not by any means. But I think he's just generally more tired and exhausted and overworked. And I think his ability and his strength to manage his stutter on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, I think that has recessed a little bit. You know, maybe at the age of 40 or 50, he had more energy to really manage the stutter, and he may not have that energy anymore, and it comes out more. It's also the sheer fact that he's probably giving more national interviews on TV and radio than at any time in his life. So there's more hours in the day in which he can have difficulty talking. And so it's all these different factors, but that is obviously a very long, roundabout answer to your question of, was it a calculated decision? And I think there is no simple answer to that question, because I think if it were a calculated decision, then in my interview at the end of August last year, I think he would have said, yes, I still stutter, and that would be the headline of the story: Joe Biden, I still stutter. Extra, extra, read all about it. And it didn't happen that way. And he's had a lot of other opportunities to say that exact sentence, and it hasn't quite come out. And so I think he's a person. I think he's working with it, and he's kind of come to terms with his present fluency or disfluency or mix. And I think at the end of the day, this gray area that people may find themselves in regarding his speech, I think it shows him to be just another flawed person.
It's a humanizing thing,
Mm-hmm.
for sure. And, well, once again, we can't run history over twice, but there's a good chance that if you don't have that idea for that article, which you then brought to the higher ups at the Atlantic, who it sounds like were overwhelmingly like, yes, let's do this story for sure. If that story doesn't happen, then it seems to me pretty likely that the CNN, that maybe he doesn't answer the CNN question like this. Of course, we can't prove this, but he was already stepping out of the closet a little bit. I mean, I know he wasn't totally in the closet about his past, but in terms of the, how kind of raw the feelings still are, and all of us that stutter. I mean, those childhood feelings, like, we can name to a person those people that made fun of us as a kid, probably.
Oh yeah. Oh, and when he was talking to me, at one point when he was talking about his 7th grade classroom, he pointed over my shoulder and he became transfixed, and he was imagining the whole thing over again, his 7th grade classroom in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And it was just like a movie where it's as if someone snapped their fingers, and now we're back in the room, and he wasn't even looking at me at that point. He was looking over my shoulder, and he's like telling me, and I sat there, blah blah blah, and it was really powerful. Those memories are visceral.
Well, and the fact that you helped to bring those out and started that process of him kind of stepping out, and if he is elected, and I know you're a journalist, so you have to, play this straight and not have a favorite. But if there's a person that stutters that's in the White House, I mean, that obviously has never happened. I think there may have been some president that stuttered a little bit or something as a kid, but to my knowledge, we've never had a person that stutters in the White House, and someone who feels for people that stutter also, right? He really, I saw a clip, not even a clip, I think I was watching C-SPAN maybe a year ago or something. The Democrat nomination process was still going on in New Hampshire, I believe it was, and it was after a speech, and how they sign autographs or give hugs or whatever to the crowd. The C-SPAN cameras are always there filming. And there was a kid, maybe 20 or so, who said, "Oh, I stutter. I have a stutter." And Biden stopped the presses. He sat and talked to this guy only for at least 5 minutes. And he had one of his handlers get the guy's phone number. He said, "I'm going to call you and we're going to talk." And it sounded almost like he was going to coach the guy on life, as a person that stutters. And then there was something I read on social media a couple weeks ago that was posted. There was a 7-year-old boy who had a stutter who asked his speech therapist, when his speech therapist said, "Oh, Joe Biden has a stutter or had a stutter or whatever." The kid said, "Oh, can I talk to him, about his stutter?" And the therapist said, "Well, probably not, but if you want to send him a letter, you can send him a letter. And so the little kid sent Biden a letter, and Biden called him up and spoke for like 20 minutes from what the Post said. The Post on Facebook, I think it was, which was from maybe a speech therapist or somebody that knew him. And so, obviously this totally pulls at Biden's heartstrings. I mean, all of us know this, right? If you've had that 7th grade experience or whatever age it happened, you can forever identify with the pain of stuttering, especially in childhood. And so it certainly pulls at his heartstrings. So if he gets in the White House, and I won't, give up my favorites either, but if he gets in the White House, that, as somebody who cares about stuttering, I would say, that could be a game changer. And I would guess, you might have some more really high quality articles to write at that point about stuttering and Joe Biden, perhaps.
We'll see. And like I mentioned, I'm just at the onset of this book project, and I'm really excited about interviewing not only other famous people who stutter, but regular everyday folks from all over. I have this massive list of people and where they're from, and a little bit about them, and that's just a list I've been building over the past year since my article came out. But if anybody watching this is interested in talking with me and sharing your story, I have an email address set up for the project, and it's lifeondelaybook@gmail.com. And my goal is to, as you were getting at there, Mike, it's to just like give visibility to this disability and give people a platform to share their stories and tell me what it's like. And so often, so many of us who stutter don't want to talk about it, and we especially don't want to be interviewed. We especially don't enjoy talking on the phone. But I've had some profound conversations, and it's a real privilege just to get to meet other people in the community.
I completely agree with that. Well, John, we'll let you run. I'm sure you got a senator or a governor or something lined up to talk to here, so I won't take any more of your time, but I very much appreciate you coming on. And I'll say something I really like about the way that you handle your stutter is that you're saying what you want to say. So whether you're going to have a block or not, you're going to finish a coherent, intelligent sentence rather than, throwing in 5 filler words and choosing words that you don't want to say. And I think that's powerful because you're saying what you want to say, and that's one of the big things that makes it, that can make it especially miserable to have a stutter when we're somebody else talking here, and we're not saying what we want to say, only what we can say.
Thank you, and thank you for your thoughtful questions and for inviting me on in the first place.
Absolutely, man. So take care, and we'll talk to you later.
All right, that sounds great.